The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province as Captain Sarah Mitchell received the radio transmission that would change everything. Static crackled through her headset as the desperate voice of Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez echoed from the forward operating base. "We have a situation, Captain. 340 Marines are pinned down in the valley. Enemy forces have them surrounded on 3 sides and air support is 20 minutes out. They won't last that long." Sarah's hands tightened around the radio as she processed the gravity of the situation. She was a medical evacuation pilot with over 8 years of experience flying dangerous rescue missions. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. The image of 340 young Marines trapped in hostile territory sent a chill down her spine. The mission had started as a routine patrol operation. Alpha Company, Bravo Company, and Charlie Company had been conducting a sweep through the valley searching for insurgent activity. Intelligence reports had suggested minimal enemy presence in the area. Those reports were catastrophically wrong. As dawn broke, the 3 companies found themselves walking into a carefully orchestrated ambush. Hidden insurgent forces had positioned themselves strategically throughout the rocky outcroppings and abandoned buildings that dotted the landscape. Machine gun nests, mortar positions, and sniper teams had been waiting in silence for hours. The first shots rang out at exactly 06:47 hours. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson was leading point when the bullet struck the rock inches from his head. Before he could shout a warning, the entire valley erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes sparked from every direction as the Marines dove for whatever cover they could find. Within minutes, the situation became clear. The Marines were trapped in a kill zone with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. Radio chatter filled the airwaves as company commanders tried to coordinate their defensive positions while calling for immediate backup. Captain Rodriguez, monitoring the situation from the command center, watched helplessly as the red dots representing his Marines appeared completely surrounded on the tactical display. The nearest ground reinforcements were 2 hours away. Standard air support was experiencing mechanical difficulties and wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. Sarah Mitchell stood in the hangar bay, staring at her Black Hawk helicopter. The aircraft had been her trusted companion through countless missions, but this would test both machine and pilot beyond anything they had faced before. Her crew chief, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, was already performing pre-flight checks with unusual urgency. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. 340 lives hung in the balance, and she was being asked to fly into what amounted to a shooting gallery. The valley was narrow, surrounded by high ridges that provided perfect vantage points for enemy shooters. Any helicopter entering that airspace would become an immediate target. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant David Chen, approached with the mission briefing folder. His usually calm demeanor showed cracks of concern as he outlined the tactical situation. The enemy had established overlapping fields of fire that made any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Sarah listened to every detail while calculating the risks in her head. The geography worked against them. The narrow valley meant limited maneuvering room. The high ridges provided enemy forces with elevated firing positions. Most concerning was the intelligence estimate that suggested at least 200 insurgent fighters were participating in the ambush. Despite the overwhelming odds, Sarah felt a familiar surge of determination. These weren't just numbers on a tactical display. They were Marines, many barely out of high school, who had trusted their leaders to bring them home safely. She had taken an oath to never leave a fallen comrade behind, and that oath extended to every service member in danger. The radio crackled again with an update from the valley. Casualties were mounting. Several Marines had been wounded by sniper fire, and medical supplies were running dangerously low. The company medics were doing their best with limited resources, but they needed immediate evacuation for the most seriously injured. Time was running out. Every minute of delay meant more Marines would be wounded or killed. The enemy forces seemed to have unlimited ammunition and were systematically targeting anyone who moved. The Marines had managed to establish defensive positions among the rocks and abandoned structures, but they couldn't hold indefinitely. Sarah made her decision. She would fly into that valley, regardless of the personal risk. Her crew looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern, knowing that she was asking them to join her on what might be a suicide mission. Each member of her team nodded their agreement without hesitation. The helicopter's engines roared to life as Sarah began her final equipment checks. She strapped on her body armor, adjusted her helmet, and ran through the mental checklist that had kept her alive through hundreds of previous missions. This time felt different. This time, the stakes couldn't be higher. As the Black Hawk lifted off from the base, Sarah could see the distant smoke rising from the valley where 340 Marines were fighting for their lives. She pushed the aircraft to maximum speed, knowing that every second counted. Behind her, the medical team prepared stretchers and supplies for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging rescue operation of their careers. The radio continued to broadcast updates from the besieged Marines. Their ammunition was running low, casualties were increasing, and enemy forces were attempting to close the noose. Captain Mitchell flew toward the sound of distant gunfire, knowing that she was their only hope for survival. The Black Hawk helicopter cut through the morning air at maximum speed as Captain Sarah Mitchell approached the danger zone. Through her headset, she could hear the increasing desperation in the radio transmissions from the trapped Marines below. Gunfire echoed continuously across the valley, punctuated by the sharp crack of sniper rifles and the thunderous boom of mortar rounds. Phoenix 1, "This is ground control," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez. "Be advised, enemy has established multiple firing positions on the ridgelines. Recommend you abort this mission and wait for air support." Sarah's jaw tightened as she responded. "Negative, ground control. Those Marines can't wait 20 minutes. We're going in now." Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Chen, was scanning the terrain ahead through binoculars. The valley appeared deceptively peaceful from a distance, but the occasional puff of smoke from explosions told a different story. As they drew closer, the full scope of the battle became visible. The Marines were scattered across a roughly circular area about half a mile in diameter. They had taken cover behind rocky outcroppings, abandoned mud brick buildings, and whatever natural shelter they could find. The enemy forces had positioned themselves in a nearly perfect ring around the trapped Americans, firing down from elevated positions that provided excellent cover and clear lines of sight. "I count at least 15 different muzzle flashes," Chen reported. "They've got machine gun nests on the north and south ridges and what looks like a mortar team behind that cluster of buildings to the east." Sarah studied the tactical situation as they approached. Landing in the valley would be like flying into the center of a hornet's nest. Every second they remained on the ground would expose them to concentrated fire from multiple directions. She would need to find a landing zone that provided some protection, while still allowing wounded Marines to reach the aircraft. Sergeant O'Brien, the crew chief, was checking the defensive systems and preparing the medical bay. "Captain, we've got room for 12 stretcher cases or 20 walking wounded per trip. At that rate, we'll need at least 15 runs to get everyone out." The mathematics were sobering. 15 trips into an active combat zone where enemy forces were specifically targeting any aircraft. The odds of completing even half those missions successfully seemed remote, but Sarah pushed those thoughts aside. Her job was to save lives, not calculate probabilities. As they crested the final ridge before the valley, the intensity of the battle below became fully apparent. Tracer rounds streaked across the landscape like deadly fireworks. Smoke billowed from several locations where mortar rounds had impacted. The Marines were returning fire whenever possible, but they were clearly outgunned and outmaneuvered. "Phoenix 1, this is Alpha 6, came a new voice over the radio. "We have 8 urgent casualties who need immediate evacuation. Can you see our position marked with the red smoke?" Sarah spotted the crimson plume rising from behind a cluster of large boulders on the eastern side of the valley. The location provided some cover from the northern firing positions but would still expose her helicopter to fire from the south and west. "Roger, Alpha 6. I see your smoke. Preparing for approach." She began her descent into the valley, immediately drawing attention from every enemy position. Muzzle flashes erupted from the ridgelines as insurgent fighters opened fire on the incoming helicopter. The distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft filled the cockpit. "Taking fire from multiple positions," Chen reported calmly, though his knuckles were white as he gripped his seat. "Looks like small arms and at least one heavy machine gun." Sarah threw the Black Hawk into an evasive pattern, using the terrain features to mask their approach as much as possible. She flew below the ridgeline whenever possible, using the natural contours of the land to provide momentary protection from the enemy shooters. A mortar round exploded 50 yards to their left, close enough to rock the helicopter with its concussion. Shrapnel peppered the armored belly of the aircraft, but the vital systems remained intact. Sarah continued her approach, fighting to control the aircraft as enemy fire intensified. 30 seconds to landing, she announced over the intercom. Medical team, prepare for immediate loading. We'll be on the ground for 90 seconds maximum. The crew understood the timeline. Any longer on the ground would make them an easy target for enemy mortars or rocket-propelled grenades. They would need to load the most critically wounded Marines and get airborne before the enemy could coordinate a concentrated attack on their position. As the Black Hawk touched down behind the boulder cluster, Marines immediately began emerging from their defensive positions. Several were carrying wounded comrades on improvised stretchers, while others provided covering fire to suppress enemy shooters who had clear lines of sight to the landing zone. The scene that greeted Sarah's medical team was chaotic and heartbreaking. Young Marines, some barely 18 years old, bore wounds from shrapnel and gunfire. Despite their injuries, many were still trying to help their wounded comrades reach the helicopter. Corporal Jennifer Walsh, the flight medic, immediately triaged the casualties as they were loaded aboard. "We've got 3 urgent surgical cases and 5 serious but stable," she reported. "Loading now." Enemy fire continued to rake the area around the helicopter. Bullets sparked off the rocks and pinged against the aircraft's armored hull. One round shattered a side window, filling the cabin with flying glass fragments. Sarah kept the engines at flight power, ready to lift off at a moment's notice. Staff Sergeant Thompson, the Marine who had been leading point when the ambush began, helped carry one of the wounded to the helicopter. Blood streamed from a gash above his eye, but he refused to leave until all the more seriously wounded had been loaded. "That's 8 loaded," O'Brien called out. "We're at capacity." Sarah immediately began lifting off, even as Marines continued to fire at enemy positions to cover their departure. As the Black Hawk climbed away from the valley floor, she could see the faces of the Marines still trapped below. More than 300 remained in the kill zone, depending on her to return. The flight back to base took 12 minutes. During that time, Corporal Walsh and her team worked frantically to stabilize the wounded Marines. 2 were in critical condition, requiring immediate surgery upon arrival. The others would live, but they needed more medical attention than could be provided in the field. As they approached the base, Sarah was already planning her next trip into the valley. She had saved 8 lives, but 332 Marines were still trapped and fighting for survival. The enemy now knew her aircraft's capabilities and would be better prepared for her return. The real test was just beginning. The Black Hawk touched down at the base medical facility with its precious cargo of wounded Marines. As the medical team rushed the injured soldiers to the emergency treatment area, Captain Sarah Mitchell remained in the cockpit, her hands still gripping the controls. She had exactly 8 minutes to refuel, check for damage, and prepare for her second trip into hell. Sergeant O'Brien was already conducting a rapid inspection of the aircraft. 3 bullet holes had penetrated the fuselage, but miraculously, none had damaged critical systems. The shattered window would need to be covered with protective material, but the helicopter remained flight-worthy. "We took hits to the cargo compartment and 1 round grazed the tail rotor housing," O'Brien reported. "Nothing that'll keep us grounded, but she's going to be even more vulnerable on the next run." Lieutenant Chen was monitoring radio traffic from the valley. The situation had deteriorated since their departure. Enemy forces had moved closer to the Marine positions, and ammunition supplies were critically low. Several more Marines had been wounded by sniper fire, and 1 entire squad was completely cut off from the main defensive perimeter. "Phoenix 1, this is Bravo 6, came an urgent transmission. We have a squad of 12 Marines trapped in Building Complex Alpha 7. They're surrounded and taking heavy fire. Priority evacuation requested." Sarah studied the tactical map, locating the building complex on the western edge of the valley. It was even more exposed than her previous landing zone, situated in an area where enemy forces could target the helicopter from 3 different ridgelines simultaneously. "Roger. Bravo 6 will extract them on our next run. Mark your position with yellow smoke." The refueling truck had already connected to the Black Hawk's fuel system. As aviation fuel flowed into the tanks, Sarah reviewed the lessons learned from her first mission. The enemy had reacted quickly to her approach, but they seemed to focus their fire on the helicopter rather than coordinating attacks on the landing zones. Corporal Walsh climbed back aboard the aircraft. Her medical supplies restocked, and her team ready for another rescue mission. Despite having just witnessed the horrors of combat casualties, her determination remained unshaken. "The 3 critical cases are stable and heading into surgery," she reported. "We're ready to go get more of our guys." Sarah nodded and began the startup sequence. Her second trip would be more dangerous than the first. The enemy now knew her helicopter's approach routes and capabilities. They would be watching for her return and preparing countermeasures. As the Black Hawk lifted off from the base, Sarah could see smoke rising from multiple locations in the distant valley. The battle was intensifying, and time was running out for the trapped Marines. She pushed the aircraft to maximum speed, knowing that every minute of delay could cost lives. The approach to the valley was different this time. Instead of flying directly toward the target, Sarah took a circuitous route that would bring her in from an unexpected direction. She used every terrain feature available to mask her approach, flying below ridgelines and through narrow canyons whenever possible. "I see yellow smoke from building complex Alpha 7, Chen reported. "But they've got company. Looks like enemy forces have moved to within 50 meters of their position." Through her helmet-mounted display, Sarah could see the tactical situation developing below. The trapped Marines were barricaded inside a partially destroyed building, while insurgent fighters attempted to close in from multiple directions. Getting to them would require landing directly in the middle of an active firefight. "Bravo 6, this is Phoenix 1. I need you to give me 30 seconds of suppressive fire on the eastern approach when I begin my descent. Can you coordinate with Alpha and Charlie companies?" "Roger, Phoenix 1. All units will provide covering fire on your signal." Sarah began her descent into the valley, immediately drawing heavy fire from enemy positions. This time the insurgents were ready for her. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked past the aircraft as enemy fighters tried to bring down the helicopter with everything they had. "RPG launch from the North Ridge," Chen called out. "Incoming 2 o'clock high." Sarah threw the Black Hawk into a violent evasive maneuver, diving toward the valley floor as the rocket-propelled grenade exploded harmlessly above them. The sudden descent brought them dangerously close to the enemy fighters on the ground, who opened fire with automatic weapons from point-blank range. "Give me that suppressive fire now," Sarah transmitted to the Marines below. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every Marine position that had a clear line of sight opened fire on the enemy forces threatening the helicopter. The coordinated barrage forced the insurgent fighters to take cover, providing Sarah with the few seconds she needed to reach the landing zone. The Black Hawk settled onto a small patch of level ground beside the besieged building. Before the wheels fully touched down, Marines began emerging from the structure. The 12 trapped soldiers moved quickly but methodically, carrying their wounded and providing mutual support as they crossed the exposed ground to the helicopter. Enemy fire intensified as the insurgents realized what was happening. Bullets sparked off the helicopter's armor plating and shattered the remaining intact windows. One round punched through the cabin wall, missing Corporal Walsh by inches as she worked to load a wounded Marine onto a stretcher. Sergeant O'Brien returned fire with the helicopter's defensive machine gun, targeting muzzle flashes on the nearby ridgelines. His accurate fire forced several enemy shooters to relocate, buying precious seconds for the evacuation to continue. "That's 12 loaded," Walsh called out, plus 2 walking wounded from the perimeter. "We're at capacity." Sarah immediately began lifting off, even as enemy fighters continued to pour fire into the landing zone. A mortar round impacted 20 yards from the helicopter just as it cleared the ground, showering the aircraft with dirt and debris. As they climbed away from the valley, Sarah could see that the Marine defensive perimeter had contracted further. The enemy was slowly tightening the noose and the remaining Marines were running out of options. More than 300 soldiers were still trapped below, and their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The flight back to base was marked by continuous radio chatter from the valley. Unit commanders were reporting critically low ammunition supplies and an increasing number of casualties. The enemy had brought up reinforcements and was preparing for a final assault on the Marine positions. "Phoenix 1, this is ground control," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez. "Air support is still 15 minutes out. How many more runs can you make?" Sarah did the math in her head. At her current rate, she could evacuate perhaps 50 more Marines before air support arrived. That would still leave nearly 300 soldiers trapped in the valley when the enemy launched their final attack. "Ground control, I'll keep flying until every Marine is out or my aircraft is shot down. No one gets left behind. As the Black Hawk approached the base for its second landing, Sarah was already planning her third trip into the fire. The enemy was adapting to her tactics, but she would adapt as well. 320 Marines were counting on her to bring them home. The third landing at the base medical facility was executed with military precision, but Sarah Mitchell could see the concern in the faces of the ground crew. Her Black Hawk helicopter now bore the scars of multiple combat missions, bullet holes, shattered windows, and scorch marks from near-miss explosions. The aircraft was holding together, but barely. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez approached the cockpit as the wounded Marines were being unloaded. "Captain, I'm recommending we ground this bird. You've taken too much damage, and the risk assessment shows a high probability of catastrophic failure on your next mission." Sarah looked at the maintenance chief with steely determination. "How long do you need to patch the critical systems?" 6 minutes to replace the damaged hydraulic lines and seal the fuel tank punctures. "But Captain, this aircraft isn't designed to take this kind of punishment repeatedly." "Then we better make sure the next few missions count." While the maintenance crew worked frantically on emergency repairs, Sarah received an update from the valley that changed everything. Charlie Company had managed to fight their way to an abandoned school building that offered better defensive positions, but the movement had cost them dearly. 7 Marines had been wounded during the fighting withdrawal, and their medical supplies were completely exhausted. Lieutenant Chen was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, trying to piece together the tactical picture. "The enemy has repositioned their heavy weapons," he reported. "They've moved 2 machine gun teams to the southern ridge, and intelligence thinks they've brought up mortars to the eastern approach." The noose was tightening around the trapped Marines. Enemy forces had demonstrated remarkable tactical coordination, systematically closing off escape routes while positioning their most effective weapons to target any rescue attempts. Sarah realized that conventional approaches would no longer work. Corporal Walsh climbed back aboard the helicopter, her medical bag restocked, but her face showing the strain of treating multiple combat casualties. "Captain, we've evacuated 20 Marines so far, but the wounds are getting worse. The enemy is using heavier weapons, and the guys down there are taking more serious hits." Sarah studied the tactical display one more time. The enemy's repositioning had created a narrow window of opportunity. If she approached from the north and used the abandoned school building to mask her approach, she might be able to reach Charlie Company's position before the enemy could coordinate their fire. "Sergeant O'Brien, what's our defensive capability?" "The door gun is fully operational, and I've loaded armor-piercing rounds for the heavy weapons positions. We can provide covering fire, but we'll be exposed to counter-battery fire from multiple directions." The maintenance crew completed their emergency repairs and gave Sarah a thumbs up. The helicopter was as ready as it could be under the circumstances. Time was running out for the Marines in the valley, and every minute of delay increased the likelihood that the enemy would overrun their positions. As the Black Hawk lifted off for its third combat mission, Sarah could see additional smoke rising from the valley. The Marines were being forced to use their remaining ammunition more sparingly, which meant less suppressive fire to cover her approach. The enemy, meanwhile, seemed to have unlimited supplies and was maintaining constant pressure on all sides. "Phoenix 1, this is Charlie 6, came an urgent transmission. "We're taking heavy mortar fire at the school building. Estimate 15 casualties, including several urgent surgical cases. Request immediate evacuation." "Roger, Charlie 6, approaching from the north in 3 minutes. Have your wounded ready for immediate loading." Sarah began her approach using a different route than her previous missions. Instead of flying directly into the valley, she followed a dry riverbed that provided natural concealment from most enemy positions. The technique worked initially, allowing her to get within half a mile of the target before being detected. When the enemy finally spotted the helicopter, their response was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions, creating a crossfire pattern that filled the air with tracer rounds. Sarah was forced to fly through the deadly barrage, using every evasive maneuver in her repertoire to avoid being shot down. Taking hits to the main rotor assembly, Chen reported as the helicopter shuddered under enemy fire. Still flyable, but we're losing hydraulic pressure. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the cockpit, missing by less than 10 feet. The explosion behind them rocked the aircraft violently, But Sarah maintained control and continued her approach to the school building. The Marines below were depending on her to reach them, regardless of the personal risk. As the Black Hawk descended toward the school's courtyard, Sarah could see the extent of the carnage. The building had taken multiple direct hits from mortar rounds, and debris littered the landing zone. Several Marines were lying motionless in the courtyard, while others were dragging wounded comrades toward the helicopter. The moment the aircraft touched down, enemy fire intensified dramatically. The insurgents had positioned themselves to have clear fields of fire into the courtyard, turning the rescue operation into a deadly gauntlet. Bullets sparked off the concrete around the helicopter as Marines worked desperately to load their wounded comrades. Sergeant O'Brien engaged multiple enemy positions with the door gun, his accurate fire forcing several machine gun teams to relocate. His covering fire was the only thing preventing the enemy from overrunning the landing zone completely. "We've got 12 loaded, including 3 urgent surgical cases," Walsh reported. "But there are more wounded inside the building who can't be moved safely." Sarah made a split-second decision that violated every safety protocol. "We're staying until everyone is loaded." "O'Brien, keep that covering fire going." For the next 90 seconds, the Black Hawk remained on the ground under constant enemy fire. Marines formed a human chain to carry wounded comrades from the building to the helicopter, exposing themselves to deadly crossfire in order to save their brothers in arms. A mortar round impacted 30 yards from the aircraft, showering everyone with concrete fragments and dust. The explosion damaged the helicopter's tail rotor, causing severe vibrations that made the aircraft almost uncontrollable. Sarah fought to keep the machine stable while the loading continued. "That's 18 Marines loaded," O'Brien called out. "We're overweight, but everyone's aboard." Sarah immediately began lifting off, the damaged helicopter struggling to gain altitude with its heavy load. The tail rotor damage made every movement unpredictable, requiring constant control inputs to prevent the aircraft from spinning out of control. As they climbed away from the school building, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving to occupy the positions the Marines had just abandoned. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and time was running out for the remaining 300 Marines still trapped in the valley. "Phoenix 1, this is ground control. Air support is 10 minutes out. Can you hold until then?" Sarah looked at her damaged aircraft's instruments and calculated the risks. The helicopter was barely flyable, her crew was exhausted, and the enemy was adapting to her tactics with each mission. But 300 Marines were still depending on her to bring them home. "Ground control, I'm going back. Those Marines don't have 10 minutes. The damaged Black Hawk helicopter limped back to base with 18 wounded Marines aboard, its tail rotor throwing off dangerous vibrations that made every moment in the air a fight for survival. Captain Sarah Mitchell's hands were cramped from gripping the controls so tightly, but her determination remained unshaken, despite the overwhelming odds against success. As they approached the base, Chief Martinez was already waiting with his maintenance crew. One look at the helicopter told him everything he needed to know. The aircraft had been pushed far beyond its design limits and was operating on borrowed time. "Captain, I cannot in good conscience clear this aircraft for another mission," Martinez said as soon as Sarah shut down the engines. "The tail rotor bearing is damaged. You've lost 30% of your hydraulic fluid, and the main transmission is showing stress fractures." Sarah studied the maintenance report while watching the medical team rush the wounded Marines to the emergency treatment facility. In 3 missions, she had evacuated 38 soldiers, but more than 300 remained trapped in the valley. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Lieutenant Chen approached with an intelligence update that made the situation even more desperate. "The enemy has brought up reinforcements. Satellite imagery shows at least 50 additional fighters moving into position around the valley. They're preparing for a final assault on our Marines." The radio crackled with urgent transmissions from the battlefield. Alpha Company was reporting critically low ammunition, with some squads down to their last magazines. Bravo Company had lost contact with 2 of their fire teams, and Charlie Company was requesting immediate medical evacuation for 6 Marines with life-threatening injuries. "Phoenix 1, this is ground control," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez. "Air support has been delayed another 15 minutes due to mechanical problems. Can you continue operations?" Sarah looked at her crew, seeing the exhaustion and concern in their faces. They had already performed 3 missions under impossible conditions, and asking them to fly a damaged aircraft into combat again was beyond what any reasonable commander would request. Sergeant O'Brien spoke first. "Captain, we've come this far. Those Marines are counting on us. I say we finish what we started." Corporal Walsh nodded her agreement. "We can't abandon them now. They would do the same for us." Lieutenant Chen checked his instruments one more time. "The aircraft is marginal, but it'll fly. If we're careful with our approach and don't push the damaged systems too hard, we might make it." Sarah felt the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders. She was being asked to risk the lives of her crew to save Marines who might die regardless of her actions. But looking into their faces, she saw the same determination that had driven her throughout this desperate day. "Martinez, give me 5 minutes of emergency repairs. Do whatever you can to stabilize the tail rotor." The maintenance chief shook his head but began directing his crew to work on the most critical systems. They bypassed damaged hydraulic lines, reinforced stress points with emergency patches, and added additional transmission fluid to compensate for the ongoing leaks. As the repairs continued, Sarah received a transmission that changed her tactical approach entirely. Captain James Sullivan, commanding Alpha Company, had identified a large clearing in the center of the valley that could accommodate multiple helicopters. If she could reach that location, she might be able to evacuate 50 or 60 Marines in a single trip. Phoenix 1. The central clearing is designated Landing Zone Bravo. We can provide overlapping fields of fire to protect your approach, but you'll be exposed to enemy fire from all directions once you're on the ground. Sarah studied the tactical map, recognizing the enormous risk involved in Sullivan's proposal. The central clearing was within effective range of every enemy weapon system in the valley. Landing there would be like placing her helicopter in the center of a target range with dozens of shooters firing simultaneously. But it was also their best chance of evacuating a significant number of Marines before the enemy's final assault. If she could successfully complete one large-scale evacuation, it might buy enough time for air support to arrive and turn the tide of battle. Alpha 6, I'll attempt Landing Zone Bravo on my next mission. Have your most seriously wounded Marines ready for immediate loading." The maintenance crew completed their emergency repairs and stepped back from the helicopter. Chief Martinez approached Sarah one final time, his expression grave with concern. "Captain, I've done everything possible to keep this bird in the air, but I cannot guarantee it will survive another mission. The stress fractures in the transmission are getting worse and the tail rotor could fail at any moment." Sarah nodded her understanding while starting the helicopter's engines. The damaged aircraft shuddered and vibrated more violently than before, but the systems remained functional. She would have to nurse the machine carefully to have any chance of completing another rescue mission. As the Black Hawk lifted off from the base, Sarah could see that the smoke over the valley had intensified. The enemy was increasing their rate of fire, systematically destroying the Marines' defensive positions. Time was running out, and this might be her last opportunity to make a significant difference. "Phoenix 1, this is Alpha 6, came Sullivan's voice over the radio. "Enemy forces are massing for a final assault. We estimate 20 minutes before they overrun our positions. Whatever you're going to do, it needs to happen now." Sarah pushed the damaged helicopter to its maximum safe speed, knowing that mechanical failure was now as dangerous as enemy fire. The aircraft responded sluggishly to her control inputs, and warning lights flickered intermittently on the instrument panel. As they approached the valley for the 4th time, the scope of the battle below was overwhelming. The Marines had been compressed into an area roughly the size of 2 football fields, surrounded by enemy forces that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. Muzzle flashes sparked from every direction as the insurgents maintained constant pressure on the shrinking defensive perimeter. "I count over 60 Marines in the central clearing," Chen reported. "But the enemy has positioned heavy weapons to target that exact location. The moment we touch down, we'll be sitting ducks." Sarah studied the tactical situation one final time. Landing in the central clearing would expose her crew and aircraft to concentrated fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The chances of survival were minimal, but 300 Marines were depending on her to take that risk. "All stations, this is Phoenix 1. Beginning approach to Landing Zone Bravo. Provide maximum suppressive fire on my signal." The damaged Black Hawk began its descent into what might be the final mission of the day. The damaged Black Hawk helicopter descended into the valley's central clearing like a wounded bird falling from the sky. Captain Sarah Mitchell fought to control the aircraft as the damaged tail rotor caused violent vibrations that threatened to tear the machine apart. Every enemy weapon in the valley seemed focused on the incoming helicopter, creating a storm of bullets and explosions that filled the air around them. Phoenix 1. All units are providing covering fire. Captain Sullivan transmitted from Alpha Company's position. You have maximum suppressive fire for 90 seconds. The Marines below opened fire with everything they had, creating a thunderous barrage that temporarily forced enemy fighters to take cover. But Sarah could see that the suppressive fire was costing the Marines their last reserves of ammunition. They were giving her their final bullets to complete this desperate rescue mission. As the helicopter approached the clearing, Lieutenant Chen provided a running commentary on the threats surrounding them. RPG team moving on the eastern ridge. Machine gun nest repositioning to the south. Mortar team has us bracketed and is adjusting fire. Sarah acknowledged each threat while making minute adjustments to her approach. The damaged helicopter responded sluggishly to her commands, making precise flying nearly impossible. Warning lights flashed continuously on the instrument panel as stressed systems approached their breaking points. 30 seconds to touchdown, she announced to her crew. This is going to be the longest 90 seconds of our lives. The moment the Black Hawk's wheels touched the ground, the clearing erupted in chaos. 60 Marines emerged from defensive positions around the perimeter, carrying wounded comrades and providing covering fire as they converged on the helicopter. The scene was simultaneously heroic and heartbreaking as young soldiers risked their lives to save their brothers in arms. Enemy fire intensified dramatically as insurgent fighters realized this might be their last chance to destroy the rescue helicopter. Bullets sparked off the aircraft's armor plating while rocket-propelled grenades streaked overhead. One RPG impacted just 20 yards from the helicopter, showering everyone with dirt and debris. Corporal Walsh and her medical team worked frantically to load the most seriously wounded Marines first. We've got multiple urgent surgical cases, she reported. These guys need to get to the hospital immediately. Sergeant O'Brien maintained covering fire with the door gun, targeting enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to the loading operation. His accurate shooting forced several insurgent teams to relocate, buying precious seconds for the evacuation to continue. Transmission temperature is redlining, Chen reported as he monitored the aircraft's vital systems. We're going to lose the main transmission if we stay much longer. Sarah could feel the helicopter beginning to shake apart around them. The damaged tail rotor was creating harmonic vibrations that were tearing the aircraft's structure apart. But Marines were still moving toward the helicopter, and she refused to leave anyone behind. A mortar round impacted 15 yards from the aircraft, closer than any previous hit. The explosion damaged the helicopter's fuel system and shattered the remaining intact windows. Fuel began leaking from punctured tanks, creating a fire hazard that could turn the aircraft into a fireball at any moment. That's 40 Marines loaded, O'Brien called out. We're severely overweight, but they're all aboard. Sarah immediately began the takeoff sequence, knowing that every second on the ground increased the risk of catastrophic failure. The overloaded helicopter struggled to lift off, its damaged systems pushed far beyond their design limits. The main rotor blades flexed dangerously under the excessive weight, while the transmission temperature climbed into the critical range. As they cleared the valley floor, a rocket-propelled grenade exploded directly beneath the aircraft. The blast wave threw the helicopter violently to one side, causing it to nearly crash into the rocky hillside. Sarah fought to regain control as multiple warning systems activated simultaneously. We've lost hydraulic pressure in the primary system, Chen reported. Switching to backup, but it's only operating at 60% capacity. The flight back to base became a test of pilot skill and aircraft endurance. The damaged helicopter bucked and shuddered with each control input, while fuel continued to leak from the damaged tanks. Sarah had to constantly adjust her flying technique to compensate for the aircraft's deteriorating condition. Behind her, Corporal Walsh and her team worked desperately to stabilize the wounded Marines. Several had suffered additional injuries during the chaotic loading process, and the medical team was running low on critical supplies. 2 Marines were in critical condition and might not survive the flight to the hospital. Phoenix 1, this is ground control, came Rodriguez's voice. Air support is finally inbound. F-16s will be on station in 5 minutes. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while calculating how many Marines remained in the valley. She had evacuated approximately 78 soldiers in 4 missions, leaving roughly 260 still trapped. The arriving air support might be able to suppress enemy forces long enough for additional helicopters to complete the evacuation, but only if she could successfully land her damaged aircraft. Fuel leak is getting worse, Chen reported as they approached the base. We might not have enough fuel for another mission even if they could repair the aircraft. The reality of their situation was becoming clear. Sarah had pushed her helicopter and crew to their absolute limits, but they had reached the end of their capabilities. The aircraft was barely flyable, her crew was exhausted, and the enemy had demonstrated their ability to adapt to her tactics. As the base came into view, Sarah could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves along the runway. The ground crew had been monitoring her radio transmissions and knew that this landing might not go smoothly. Chief Martinez and his maintenance team were already preparing for an emergency response. Tower, this is Phoenix 1 declaring an emergency. We have multiple system failures and are coming in heavy with 40 wounded Marines aboard. Roger, Phoenix 1. You are cleared for emergency landing on runway 27. Emergency crews are standing by. Sarah began her final approach to the base, fighting to control the dying helicopter as its systems failed one by one. The main transmission was making grinding sounds that indicated imminent failure, while the fuel leak had created a visible stream behind the aircraft. In the cargo compartment, 40 Marines owed their lives to Sarah's courage and her crew's dedication. Some would require months of recovery, but they would survive to see their families again. The question now was whether Sarah herself would survive the landing of her critically damaged aircraft. As the runway approached, Sarah prepared for what might be the most challenging landing of her career. The damaged Black Hawk helicopter approached the base runway with smoke trailing from its leaking fuel system and sparks flying from the grinding transmission. Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls with white knuckles as she fought to keep the dying aircraft in the air long enough to save the 40 wounded Marines in her cargo compartment. Transmission failure is imminent, Lieutenant, Chen reported as warning alarms filled the cockpit. We've got maybe 30 seconds before we lose all power. The runway stretched ahead of them like a lifeline, but Sarah could feel the helicopter beginning to lose lift as the main rotor system started to fail. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the runway, their crews ready to respond to what looked like an inevitable crash landing. Phoenix 1, you are cleared for emergency landing, the tower controller transmitted. Emergency crews are in position and medical teams are standing by for immediate casualty evacuation. Sarah began her final approach, using every ounce of skill accumulated over 8 years of flying dangerous missions. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as she reduced power, fighting her every input as critical systems continued to fail. Behind her, Corporal Walsh braced the wounded Marines for what might be a rough landing. 10 seconds to touchdown, Sarah announced. Everyone hold on. The helicopter hit the runway hard, bouncing twice before settling onto its landing gear. The impact caused the main transmission to seize completely, filling the cabin with the acrid smell of burning metal and hydraulic fluid. But they were down, and they were alive. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft before the rotor blades stopped turning. Medical teams immediately began evacuating the wounded Marines while firefighters sprayed foam on the leaking fuel to prevent an explosion. Sarah remained in her seat for a moment, her hands shaking as the adrenaline finally began to wear off. Chief Martinez approached the cockpit with an expression of amazement and concern. Captain, in 30 years of maintaining helicopters, I've never seen an aircraft take this much damage and still fly. You shouldn't have been able to get this bird off the ground, let alone complete 4 combat missions. As Sarah climbed out of the damaged helicopter, she could see the extent of the destruction. Bullet holes riddled the fuselage. The tail rotor was barely attached and hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the aircraft. It was a miracle that the machine had held together long enough to complete the mission. Phoenix 1, this is ground control, came Rodriguez's voice over the radio. Air support is now on station and engaging enemy positions. Additional helicopters are inbound to complete the evacuation. Sarah looked toward the distant valley where more than 200 Marines were still fighting for their lives. The F-16 fighter jets were already attacking enemy positions with precision-guided munitions, while 2 additional Black Hawks approached the combat zone to continue the rescue operation. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of activity. With air support suppressing enemy forces, The additional helicopters were able to complete the evacuation of all remaining Marines from the valley. The final count showed that 340 Marines had been extracted from the kill zone, with Sarah's 4 missions accounting for 78 of those rescues. The casualty reports painted a sobering picture of the battle. 43 Marines had been wounded during the engagement, with 12 requiring immediate surgery. But remarkably, not a single American life had been lost. Every Marine who entered that valley came home alive, largely due to Sarah's willingness to risk everything to save them. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the base hospital visiting the Marines she had rescued. Many were still recovering from their wounds, but their spirits remained high. Staff Sergeant Thompson, the Marine who had been leading point when the ambush began, approached her bed with tears in his eyes. "Captain, I wanted to thank you personally," he said. "When we were trapped in that valley, we thought we were going to die. But you kept coming back for us even when your helicopter was falling apart. You saved all our lives." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the gratitude of the young Marines surrounding her. These soldiers, many barely out of high school, had faced death with courage and determination. They had looked out for each other even in the darkest moments, carrying wounded comrades to safety at great personal risk. "You saved yourselves," Sarah replied. "I just provided the transportation. The real heroes are the Marines who stayed behind to provide covering fire, while their wounded buddies were evacuated." 2 weeks after the battle, Sarah received orders to report to the base commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez stood behind his desk with a smile that suggested good news was coming. "Captain Mitchell, it is my privilege to inform you that you have been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in aerial combat. Your actions that day represent the finest traditions of military aviation." The citation read at the ceremony described her 4 combat missions as an extraordinary display of courage under fire that resulted in the successful evacuation of 78 wounded Marines from an active combat zone. But Sarah knew that the real reward was not the medal or the recognition. The real reward was the letters she received from the families of the Marines she had rescued. Parents thanking her for bringing their sons and daughters home safely. Wives expressing gratitude that their husbands would be there for their children's birthdays. Children writing crayon pictures of helicopters with "Thank you, Captain Sarah," scrawled in uneven letters. 6 months later, Sarah was reassigned to a training unit where she would teach the next generation of combat pilots. On her first day with the new students, she stood before a class of young aviators eager to learn the skills that might one day save lives. "Flying combat missions is not about being a hero," she told them. "It's about doing your job when others are depending on you, even when everything seems impossible." The Marines I flew with that day taught me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to abandon their brothers and sisters in arms. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell's 4 missions into the valley became legendary among military aviators. It was studied in flight schools as an example of exceptional pilot skill under extreme conditions. But for Sarah, it would always be remembered as the day when 340 Marines proved that no one gets left behind. Years later, when Sarah had retired from active duty and was working as a civilian flight instructor, she would sometimes receive visits from the Marines she had rescued. They would bring their families, introducing her to their wives and children as the woman who brought Daddy home from the war. Those moments reminded her why she had chosen to risk everything that day in Afghanistan. It was not for medals or recognition, but for the simple principle that every life has value, and every person deserves a chance to come home to the people who love them. The damaged Black Hawk helicopter that carried them all to safety was never repaired. It sits now in the base museum, its bullet holes and battle scars preserved as a reminder of what courage looks like when everything seems lost. A small plaque beside the aircraft reads simply, 340 Marines left behind on the battlefield. She risked everything and pulled them from the fire.